And we are now recording.
Great. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I see some folks on this call who know how to read, who definitely know how to read a zoning ordinance. And so, Kevin, if I miss something or if you, definitely jump in. I do not have a script. This is not meant to be like a lecture. It's really like a one-on-one, just if you give me a property, like an address, the client says, Anika, what can I build at X address? What I then do to find out what they can build there. What oftentimes happens sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes you get a version of that where somebody says, I want to build X at such and such address, can I? Or what approvals will I need to do that? So as you'll see, I've kind of made up a manufacture to fact pattern so you can see what that looks like. But I know that some of you have done this before and do not hesitate to jump in at all. This is just meant to be very casual. I should say that I sometimes, as you heard, some of you heard from me in December, we'll talk about the history or some of the social impacts of zoning. This isn't that at all. This is literally just about the mechanics of reading a zoning code. And it's at a 101 level, as Lorena said. There's like lots of other fun topics, non-conforming uses, accessory uses, comprehensive planning, this whole like alphabet soup of land use stuff that I'm just not going to cover. So again, like if there's something like that comes up for you at any point, don't hesitate to call me or email me like in real life, and I'm happy to help out with any kind of like community effort to figure out a zoning code, but this is just like the very fundamental. So with that said, what is zoning? So really basic, at the really basic level, zoning is just about what you can build where. And the first zoning rules came into being about just over 100 years ago. Okay. They came into wider application in the 1920s when the Federal Department of Commerce published a standard state zoning enabling act. That is to say, a model state statute that authorized local governments in any state that adopted that state statute to thereby adopt a zoning code. There are some funky things that arise out of this set of like this order of events, because for example, the city of New Haven gets New Haven specific authority from the state of Connecticut to adopt a zoning code before the state of Connecticut adopts the standard state zoning enabling act. So here in New Haven, you'll sometimes hear people say 8-2, which is Connecticut's zoning enabling act, doesn't apply for the city of New Haven because the city of New Haven derives its zoning authority from what's called a special act. The special act, as opposed to a general act, is a piece of state legislation that applies to a single person, corporation, or town. And so when you hear people in New Haven City Plan Department talk about the special act, or talk about, oh, don't worry about that thing in 8-2, it doesn't apply to us. That's what they're referring to, that New Haven actually had zoning authority before the state of Connecticut gave it to every other town. Connecticut's also funky because we really love to hyper regulate land use to the point where we have beach associations that have zoning authority, where literally the state of Connecticut has told a homeowners association in some of our kind of Tony shoreline communities, you get to zone. That's not a thing that exists in most states in the country, but it is a thing you see in Connecticut. So the number of zoning jurisdictions we have is actually greater than the number of towns that we have as a result of that. What rules existed 100 years ago before zoning came into being to tell you what you could build where? Well, there were some things, and those things still exist today. So just because the zoning says that you can build something doesn't mean you can definitely build something. There are nuisance laws. You can't be mean to your neighbors, in short. And then there's what we call private law. Zoning is public law. It's the government regulating a thing. But then there's also private law, which is, private parties promising each other that they will or won't do a thing. Most people probably have heard of restrictive covenants as they apply to the sale or occupation of residential property by people of color. That there was this thing called restrictive covenants that stopped people from being able to sell homes in particular neighborhoods to African-American families or Jewish families, or you've probably heard about restrictive covenants in that context. But restrictive covenants, covenants that apply to land, cover a whole host of areas. You might buy a property and see that in your deed, it prevents you from using it for certain things, particularly if you're in a suburban subdivision where whoever developed that thing on day one didn't want people to, they essentially made a promise to everybody who was buying property from them that it would stay residential forever, would stay single family forever. It's not at all uncommon in suburban subdivision covenants to see that you cannot put a bird bath in your front yard, right? That if you've just promised forever that you will never paint your house pink or put a bird bath in your front yard or put a weather vane on your, the things like that. So those aren't zoning, those are private law covenants, promises that private parties have made to each other that that apply to how you use the land. So those are all things that are not zoning. Other things that are not zoning that oftentimes get conflated with zoning: environmental laws, health codes, building codes, fire codes. If New Haven stripped out its zoning code tomorrow, you'd still have a gazillion laws on the books that protected health and safety along a number of different dimensions, where you just don't, the zoning doesn't really say anything about does a building meet modern standards for fire prevention or fire safety or sewage disposal, all these different health building code things. Those are all separate things. They all happen at the state level. They are sometimes administered at the local level by local health and building officials, fire marshal, but that's a whole nother thing. So these things, again, oftentimes get conflated. The zoning has to say X because of the environment. It turns out there's like reams and reams and reams of more pages of stuff about environmental implications of the built environment. So the zoning basically falls into 3 categories of stuff. And once we turn over to the parcel that I'm going to walk us through, we're going to go through each of these things. So the first thing is, so there's a question, would historic preservation, yeah, this is a really good question. So historic preservation is a public law thing because it comes from the government and form of regulation. They are oftentimes, they're basically 2 different kinds of historic preservation pathways under Connecticut law. There's, really 3. So there are historic districts where the historic district designation gets you eligibility for various kinds of subsidies. And those designations don't impose rules on what you can do unless you opt into the subsidy. And then if you want the subsidy, you've got to do the historically whatever thing. There are historic districts where by function of being in the historic district, you're subject to a lot of rules. And that's, I'm in Worcester Square. This is definitely one of those places where there's, lots of rules. So there's only 3 local historic districts in the city of New Haven, City Point, Worcester Square, and Fairhaven Heights, Quinnipiac Avenue. And those are places where, you want to pave your driveway, you've got to go before the Historic District Commission. They tell you whether you can. There's a third kind of oddity in Connecticut law that again exists in about half of states, which in Connecticut we call a village district, and in other places they call it a neighborhood conservation district. These are also places where they apply kind of aesthetic things. They're not as strictly historical. And the big difference between a local historic district and a village district is that in order to adopt a local historic district, the local property owners have to sign on. And basically it's so onerous that you don't want to do it. The state doesn't let you do it unless the local property owners say, yes, we want that. But village districts don't require that. It's a little bit of a runaround around the normal kind of property rights protections that come along with historic districts. But there are all these funky things that are like sort of in between. Inside of classical zoning, there's really 3 different kinds of things. So one is what we call bulk regulations, and that's just how big a thing can be. What counts as bulk regulations, you'll hear people talk about setbacks and yards, how far your built structure has to be from the street or your neighbors on the side or your neighbors in the rear. Height is a bulk restriction. You'll see maximum square footages, minimum square footages, although those are sort of problematic under state law, potentially, probably unconstitutional. There's a case that says that at least for residences, it's unconstitutional. And then something called floor area ratio, which I'll talk about later again when we go into bulk. What's floor area ratio? It's how many square feet you can build as a function of the square footage of your lot. And again, like we'll talk about that again when we go through the actual parcel that I've got collected, that I picked out of a hat to walk through. So that's bulk. The second thing is use. So what uses can you put a property to in a given neighborhood? And when we go through the New Haven zoning code, which I'll pull up, I'll share my screen in a little bit, you'll see how granular that can get. Then the third big category is what we call performance standards. These are not bulk and they're not use. They look to the actual impact of a built development. They say, maybe we don't care what you're using it for or how big it is. Like maybe there are other things we care about more that may or may not be a function of that. And a pretty good example of that is noise. So we may not care what you're using it for, but we may care if it's really loud. And impact of a thing as opposed to using the use or the size as a kind of stand-in for the thing you really care about. If the thing you really care about is how is this property affecting everyone around it, can we get at that in a more direct way? That's what performance standards are. Now there's some things that don't fit neatly into those 3 categories. So we've already talked about village districts, that's aesthetics. And you'll see in the New Haven code, we do have some places that have overlays for aesthetics. It's not use, it's not bulk, it's, what do we think? What does the government, what does the city think that you ought to do to make your development prettier? And how do you regulate that? That's complicated, but we do it all the time. Parking, you can talk about parking as a bulk regulation, but it's also kind of a use regulation. It's sort of a mandate that you use a portion of your property for parking under certain circumstances. Parking doesn't necessarily fit neatly into those categories, but obviously a big piece. And then the last thing that doesn't fit neatly into those categories is what we call planned development. And when I pull up the New Haven zoning map, you'll see what a big deal planned development is in the city of New Haven. What is planned development? So zoning's been around for about 100 years. The concept of planned development has been around for 50 or 60 years. The idea is that if you've got a larger parcel, and the textbook example of this really is like a suburban subdivision, but if you have a larger parcel, that maybe will want to give you more flexibility with how you use it. So if you have 50 acres of farmland and you're going to develop it for housing, and the zoning code says we have minimum half-acre lots. So you have in your mind, you're going to do 100 units of housing on that 50 acres. Well, maybe we're actually okay with you clustering the housing in one corner of that 50 acres and keeping 40 of it as open space. And because you have such a big lot of 50 acres, we can think about this in a more kind of imaginative way, as opposed to saying you've got to have each house on half an acre. Let's actually step back and allow you the ability to organize those 100 houses differently. And we're going to call that plan development. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to say, come to us with your plan. And then rather than apply the zoning to your plan and kind of fit your 100 units onto these 50 acres in this very regimented way, just tell us what you want to do. If we like it, cool. And then we will literally supplant the local zoning. The local zoning will sort of be stripped out and replaced with whatever your plan is. And when we pull up the New Haven zoning map, you'll see what a large amount of the city of New Haven is actually planned development, where the underlying zoning code tells you nothing about what's permitted on that particular lot. And it's been supplanted. The underlying zoning has been supplanted by this plan. So those are kind of the basic categories of zoning: bulk, use, performance standards, and then some random other things, aesthetics, plan development, and the like. Are there any questions before I move on to like who's in charge of this and how it works, who the players are? Okay, great. Interrupt me at any point. So I've already mentioned that like one player is the state. Zoning is a power that belongs to states. It does not belong to the federal government. It's not in the Constitution, right? It doesn't belong to local governments because local governments don't have powers that are not allocated to them by the state. It belongs to the state. And the reason why when zoning became hip in the 1920s, the Department of Commerce adopted this Standard State Zoning Enabling Act was because they wanted a way, an easy off-the-shelf way for states to say, we want zoning, let's give it to our local governments for them to do it. So the state is like a very important actor here because 8-2 of the Connecticut General Statutes, which is Connecticut's State Zoning Enabling Act, has a bunch of stuff in it that it tells local governments they have to do, like things they have to worry about. For example, every town's got to worry about affordable housing and multifamily housing. And most of them don't, but in theory, they have to. 8- the Zoning Enabling Act also sets out a whole bunch of procedural stuff. So, you know, what happens when somebody files an application? How long do you have to take? How long do you have to deal with it? A lot of that stuff is the stuff that New Haven says doesn't apply to it because of this special acts thing I mentioned earlier. But that's kind of okay in New Haven because New Haven moves on things a lot faster than the towns that are subject to that act do. So we don't come. But so the state is a player here. Who else is a player? So I'm going to walk through kind of like the basic players, and I'm going to kind of just point out to you where New Haven does it weird. Okay, so every town has got to have a zoning commission, and that's the commission that adopts the zoning. New Haven is weird because the Board of Alders is the zoning commission. Okay, so our legislative body is actually responsible for adopting our zoning. That is not how it works in other towns in the state or in most towns generally. You have a separate zoning commission, and they're in charge of adopting zoning. A lot of towns have combined their zoning commission with their planning commission. And so you'll see a lot of the planning and zoning commission. The planning commission is responsible for planning. The zoning commission is responsible for zoning. What does that mean? The plan is kind of a constitution that's supposed to set kind of general principles of what you want your place to look, your town to look like. And then the zoning is the rule that attempts to effectuate those principles. That's the way it's supposed to work in theory. And you can see why a lot of towns have kind of collapsed that into a single commission, because it kind of makes sense that the same group of people would do the planning and then come up with the rules. You don't have to have them in the same group. You can have separate groups for planning and zoning. And then you also need a group that's responsible for, and in New Haven, our city plan commission is our planning commission. You also need a group, you need some kind of commission or board that's charged with basically hearing complaints about how the zoning code works. So if the city comes to me, the zoning enforcement officer, the ZEO, the person who's charged with administering the zoning code, that's a city employee, says, you know, Anika, your you built a shed in your backyard and it's too close to your neighbor's property line. And I disagree with what that person has said about my shed. Then there's got to be somewhere I can appeal that to. You can appeal a parking ticket, you can appeal a zoning thing. That board in New Haven is the Board of Zoning Appeals. So they'll hear my appeal of the ZEO's ruling about my shed, but they're also there to carve out exceptions from the zoning. So if you don't like the way the zoning applies to your property, and you think that you actually have a legal argument to make that there should be an exception made for how you want to use your property, the place you go is the BZA. Now, again, New Haven's kind of complicated this a little bit because sometimes in New Haven you go to the City Plan Commission, but generally speaking, that's what BZAs are for. They're there to grant variances. What's a variance? A variance varies the application of the zoning ordinance as it applies to a given parcel. When does it do that? Only when the zoning imposes an undue burden on your parcel and where the legislature worries that if there weren't a place to go for a variance, you might actually sue the local government or the state under the Fifth Amendment because you think it's an illegal takings. So it's sort of a safety valve to say, well, don't sue us. We have this process, come through the process. We'll give you approvals then. Variances get doled out much more freely than that, but it's supposed to be a sort of very limited exception from the code. And then there's the city plan department, which is, the department inside of City Hall that really does a lot of the legwork, serving these various commissions and boards, but also doing planning work more broadly around specific developments. Okay, so those are sort of the players. Are there any questions about the players? Okay, great. So I figured the easiest way to do, well, I don't know that it's easy, but one way to do this would just be to walk through a particular parcel. And so I'm going to try to share my screen. And the parcel I chose, okay, let's see if this works. Okay, do you guys see vision appraisal? Okay, you should see 3 tabs: the zoning code, this link to New Haven maps, and then vision appraisal.
Yeah, we can see them.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I've got multiple screens open, so I'm going to try. Okay, so the parcel I chose for these purposes is the Ungers Boring Building on Grand Avenue in Worcester Square. It's in my neighborhood. They don't appear to be there very much anymore. It seems like the kind of place that was maybe ripe for redevelopment. So, like, why not think about what you could do there? Basically, was my thinking on coming up with this particular parcel. So that's what I decided we'd go with. So one thing I just wanted to mention really briefly, just in case some of you are not already familiar with Vision Appraisal, is that this is the company that the city contracts with to maintain the assessor's database. And it's really helpful anytime you're starting to do any kind of research regarding your property. I actually didn't, this may not work because I didn't actually, okay. So you need to have the exact address that the assessor uses for it. And I didn't actually check that for the Unger site. So this may not work, but let me first go into the zoning map. Okay, so the first thing you need to do when you're doing any kind of zoning research at a parcel is figure out what zoning district you're in. And that means going into the New Haven zoning map. You're going to pull now. Can you guys see the zoning map? Yep.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep,
great.
I see it.
And you can, if you kind of have the general sense of this, you can see that this stretch of Grand Avenue where Ungers is located is all zoned BA. But I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit. just to show you that you can get a little bit more granular information on each site. Okay, so this is the Ungers lot, 897. If I click on it, okay, great. It's gonna tell me who the owner is, the last time it sold, how big the parcel is, and actually it sold really recently, and I haven't been tracking this, but for all I know, this actually is happening. There's somebody is contemplating a redevelopment here. I don't know who the buyers here are. I don't recognize the name. You can see, what the assessed value is. Actually, a lot of that information that you might get on vision appraisal is actually embedded here in the zoning map. There's also stuff in here that you need to know in order to do your zoning analysis. For example, the area, the square footage of the parcel. We'll talk a minute why you need to know that. The current use is in here. So this is, kind of helpful information to start with. In addition to the map telling you you're in the BA zone, the text here also tells you this parcel is actually BA, and then there's a driveway in the back that's in the RM2, which is a residential zone. So you can get a little bit of granular information there. Let me just zoom out a little bit just to drive home the point I made earlier about planned development. So here's one in Worcester Square, this PDU 31. Here's another one, Friendship Houses, is PD 13. PDDs and PDUs are both different kinds of planned development in the city of New Haven. If I wanted to know what zoning was applicable at the Friendship Houses here at PDD 13, I basically, if I pulled up the map and saw that it was a PDD, I'd have to stop here. And then in non-pandemic times, walk down to City Hall and ask to see the file. What is available online literally will tell me nothing about what's permitted there. I need to go down to City Hall, ask for the file, and then dig through the file to see what the PDD, PD, or PDU permits, because the city has essentially overlaid that site with a site-specific zoning code that is not available online or anything like that. And luckily, knock on wood, have not had to do this during the pandemic yet, because I assume it involves somebody in City Hall sitting there making copies for me for a couple hours, and I, only have so many chits I can use and things like that. So, so that's just, there are neighborhoods where, you can already kind of see it in those two sites, but here's another one, here's another one. The Stop and Shop Plaza up on Whaley Avenue is a PDD. There's one here. They're kind of all over the place. You can see how much of the city is peppered with these things. Now I know what zone I'm in. Now I can actually turn over to the text of the zoning code. And all of this is, if you Google New Haven zoning code, it'll launch you into this. Another outside vendor, Muni Code, which has got the zoning ordinance up on this pretty easy to navigate website. And I'm just going to walk you through kind of what I would do, now sort of digging through the zoning on this. And if I can. Okay, I'm gonna, I don't know that I can easily switch back and forth between these screens, but I'll also show you the kind of memo I write up for a client as I'm doing it, okay? So the first thing is, any good lawyer will tell you, you've always got to read the definitions. We're obviously not gonna read them together today, but just to give you a sense of how fundamental the definition section is to the code, there are like 7 different definitions of the term lot, okay? I mean, you cannot, in a zoning code, you can't take the word dwelling for granted. You can't take the word lot for granted. These all mean very different things. We're going to talk about the required amount of floor area you need per unit in a residential development in the city of New Haven. And you'll see that, even what counts as floor area is not a given. It's not every square foot of built environment. There are things that are included in gross floor area. that are not included in net floor area. So, you know, what numbers are you using, that kind of thing. So you always need to read the definition section. Not going to subject you to reading the definition section with me today. The other thing I'd say, just by way of warning, is that you're going to be tempted to just like rely on the table of contents and only skip to the sections that seem like they're important to you. And that's a mistake unless you're super familiar with the thing, because there's like random stuff interspersed all throughout this thing that you might miss if you do that. So for example, somewhere in here, there are special rules for corner lots. You know, unless you know to look for it, if you have a corner lot, you might miss those special rules for corner lots. So you the first time you're doing this, you kind of do need to read the thing cover to cover. Thank goodness New Haven doesn't do this anymore, but they used to. You used to know what kind of residential development you could build in a particular business district by reference to some given residential provision in the code. I mean, it was like a, I don't know what to call it, like a maze basically, to read the thing. And there's still stuff, that's not true anymore, but there's still stuff in here like that. So you kind of, the first time you need to do this, need to read it kind of cover by cover, cover to cover, to see what, you know, what all is in here. And then finally, you just need to remember that you're looking for all three categories, right? You're looking for bulk, you're looking for use, you're looking for performance standards, and you can't just finish when you figure out what uses are permitted, or finish when you figure out which bulk, you know, what bulk things are permitted. So we're in the BA zone. It's useful, I think, just to go to the top of the BA section. Okay. At the top of Article 5, which is about business and industrial districts, there is a little description of each zone and what the code is trying to do. You know, the BA zone is the general business zone. It's the neighborhood commercial corridor zone outside of downtown. In recent years, there's been other kind of zones added here, and then there's this like narrative language that tries to explain how the BA1 is different from the BA and how the BA2 is different from the BA1. I mean, frankly, BA1 is different from BA because business owners on Grand Avenue about 15 years ago decided there were things about the BA they didn't like, and they wanted a revision. So the city created a new provision called BA1. And BA2 exists because 5 or 6 years ago in Westville Village, business owners were like, we actually would be happy to have something that's less restrictive than what currently exists. So here's what we're willing to live with. And then that happened. Similarly, downtown, you'll see there's BD, which is the downtown zone. And in recent years, in the last 10, 15 years, while there's been a building boom going on downtown, there's now BD1, BD2, BD3. You know, to some degree, these are responsive to planning. And to some degree, they're kind of like planned development. They're responsive to what the property owners in that area are willing to live with. What is, you know, if they're willing to have something that's less restrictive, then the city is generally happy to have the, you know, along many dimensions. You know, no, people are not particularly happy with less restrictive than in the dimension of kind of like vice uses and things like that, drive-throughs, fast food. There are things like that people in New Haven tend not to like. But in general, the city's generally good in recent years with density and with less parking. So that's so getting a sense of, you know, what your zone is helpful, but don't put too much stock into these narratives. They're, again, kind of helpful, but they don't really tell you what's permitted. For that, you've got to go first, again, use, bulk, performance standards. Here's first to the use table. So one of the reasons I chose a property in the BA zone is because this online version of the code is impossible to follow once you're no longer in the BA zone. It goes further down and then you can't scroll down. But BA is this first column here. So you can see that in the BA zone, you can have residential dwelling units in multifamily dwellings located above the first story, provided you've got 1,000 square feet of gross area per unit. Okay. And that what that R means is as of right. I don't need to get permission from anybody to do that. That's permitted as of right. Again, asterisk there, we'll return to that when we talk about site plan. If I want to build residential on the first floor, however, in a BA, now I've got an SP. What's an SP? SP is a special permit. And that means I've now got to go to the City Plan Commission for approval to build residential on the first floor. That's what the SP is. X means prohibited. So X means if it's there, if it's prohibited, it means that you've got to seek a variance, which you may or may not get. So that's what X is. SE is special exception. New Haven, this again, a thing that New Haven does is kind of funky that other places don't do. Every zoning code has what are called conditional uses. And a conditional use is something that you're okay with in a given zone, but not a whole lot of them, or you want to be able to finesse the details. So the textbook example is a church in a residential area. It makes sense to put churches and synagogues and houses of worship more generally in residential neighborhoods. But if you've got 5 churches on a single block, you won't be able to get anywhere on a Sunday morning, right? Assuming that people are driving to church. So maybe you don't want 5 on a single block. Well, how do you regulate that? You require them each to seek permission. And that's what a conditional use is. You know, in New Haven, first floor residential in the BA zone is a conditional use. Special permit as opposed to special exception just means that the city wants you to go to City Plan Commission instead of BCA. That's the thing that the city does that's weird, is that they have 2 different kinds of conditional uses, and some of them go to City Plan Commission and some of them go to BCA. And there are people in City Hall to whom it makes sense why some go to City Plan and why some go to BCA. It has to do with whether they think it's more of a planning type decision, like a high level planning decision, and then those go to City Plan. So that's for, you know, that's your use table. Now, this seems straightforward when we're talking about dwellings, but you start scrolling down, you'll see how granular this gets in terms of business and commercial uses. So, you know, poultry markets are different than groceries and delicatessens. They're subject to different rules. Convenience stores are different than grocery stores. Food specialty stores are different than grocery stores. And you know, you can scroll down, you hope that there's something that looks like what you're planning to do, and that's sort of close enough. And sometimes there isn't, and then you kind of call city plan staff and you say, you know, we're planning to do X, it doesn't really seem to fit in one of these categories, you know, help me out, what do we think it's closest to? Or you decide what you think it's closest to and you make an argument. But there's a gazillion uses in the use table, and you kind of see what's permitted. So I'm imagining for our hypothetical redevelopment at the Unger site that, let's say we're thinking, you know, first floor retail in the front, first floor residential, recognizing what we're seeing a lot of in the city right now, which is that there's not sufficient market for first floor commercial. So a lot of people are coming in and saying, can I put residential on part of the first floor? And then residential above. So if you were to do that, you would have to come in for that special permit for that first floor residential, right? So right off the bat, you can kind of see you would need some kind of approval from the city thing before we even get to bulk. So once you figured out your use, then the next thing is to figure out your bulk situation, and then that's section 43. And I think for here, let me first talk about FAR, and then I'll walk through the bulk, the bulk kind of review. So the first thing here, I very quickly mentioned what floor area ratio is earlier, and you'll see that really, in fact, in a number of the city's business districts, FAR, floor area ratio, is the primary regulatory limit. So in the BA zone, for example, as we'll see in a minute, there's no height limitation. It's the FAR and the parking that together kind of like, end up working together to tell you how much you can build. So what is floor area ratio? And actually, I'm going to stop the share right now because I'm going to switch over to my Word document in a second. I also want to make sure I'm looking at your faces, because floor area ratio is one of those things that takes a minute. So what's floor area ratio? So let's say you have 1,000 square foot lot, right? It's not a very big lot, but 1,000 square foot lot. And the floor area ratio is 2. That means you can build a 2,000 square foot building. So you can build 2 times whatever the FAR is. FAR can be less than 1. So if your FAR was 0.5 on a 1,000 square foot lot, you could only build a 500 square foot building. But it's essentially the relationship between the square footage of your building and the square footage of your lot, your undeveloped lot. That's FAR. It doesn't tell you anything about what that building looks like. So if you have an FAR of 2, you have a 1,000 square foot lot and a 2,000 square foot building, maybe that 2,000 square foot building is 10 stories high and each story is 200 square feet. And it's a very strange looking building. But FAR tells you nothing about how high it can be, how anything. It just says how many square feet can I build for the amount of lot area that I have. And then when you take that FAR and you squeeze it into the other parameters of height, of yards, side yards, rear yards, front yards, parking, then you kind of get like pulled into a particular building design, assuming you're not planning to apply for a significant relief. But that's what FAR is. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So let me open up the document I started earlier today that just kind of like walks through what I do. What sometimes it's lawyers, sometimes it's architects, sometimes it's an unholy combination of the two, who a client's relying on to tell them, what can I do? Can I do what I want to do? Okay, can you see this Word document that says zoning analysis Ungers?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So actually, okay, so what I've done here is I've gone through mostly the bulk provisions, but of the code. So I've pulled up the property address, pulled up like I said, you need to know the size of the lot, so pulled that from the code, and then I've kind of designed this like hypothetical building that may or may not make any sense, which is about 20 units. Basement is just mechanicals and laundry. The first floor is, like I said, half retail in front to get that nice street frontage, eyes on the street kind of thing. But then in the back, residential, recognizing that there's less of a market for this retail stuff. So we actually are seeing a lot of desire to put residential on the first floor. And then like 2 more floors of residential for a total of 24,000 square feet. You assume, say, like 20 units, let's say, seemed like the right density to me as a relative layperson for that particular site. And, could you do it? How would it work? So what I've done here is I've got the various sections of the code and then what that requirement tells you, like what it tells you have to do. So remember that the use table, it's actually, it's a bulk requirement, but it's in the use table, is that you've got to have 1,000 square feet per dwelling unit. If I were writing up this memo, I'd go back to the definition section. I'd be super careful. Are they talking about gross floor area, net floor area? But for our purposes, not worry too much about that, and say, okay, we need 20,000 square feet of building in order to get housing, right? Our FAR is 2.0 max. So that means that on this site, we could actually build a 45,000 square foot building. That's not a limitation, at least in this, this imaginary building that I've anticipated. In the BA zone, there's no height restrictions. There's no maximum coverage. So height is pretty straightforward. There are business zones in New Haven that have height requirements, maximum height requirements. Maximum coverage is how much of your lot can you cover with building? So FAR is how many square feet of building can you have on a lot? Maximum coverage is how much of your lot can you have built on? And in the BA zone in New Haven, you can actually build the whole thing. So you can cover your whole lot in building. There are yard requirements, which we'll get to in a second. But in more kind of suburban zoning codes, you'll have a maximum coverage ratio of like 15 or 20%. So you might have a 2-acre lot, but you can only build your house on 15 or 20% of that land, and you've got to keep the rest as open yard. BA zones, we don't have that. We do, however, have yard requirements. There's no front yard requirement. That makes sense. BA zone, neighborhood commercial, you would expect the buildings to be right on the sidewalk. There are no side yard requirements unless you have a side yard. This is my favorite. This took me a minute to process when I first started doing this. Once you decide to have a side yard, then you have to now meet the requirements for a side yard. And you can kind of, if anybody's walked down, basically from Willoughby's towards like campus, there's this weird little alleyway, and it like freaks me out every time. It reminds me of the space between my kitchen counter and my oven, where it's like, oh no, shit, like something fell in there. I'm just like gonna be gross forever. So there's that little alleyway next to Willoughby's that reminds me of that. And basically these side yard requirements are meant to like not have these tiny little alleyways. So you don't have to have one, but if you have one, it's now got to meet a certain size. And that size is a function of how tall your building is. So the taller your building is, the more side yard you need. There are also special rules if your business district abuts the residential district, then they actually want you to follow the residential district yard requirements so that your, the neighbors, the residential neighbors are not like smack up against it. Rear yards. So for this Unger site, we wouldn't have to have a side yard. You wouldn't be required to have a side yard. If you had one, it'd have to meet, but you don't have to have one. You do have to have a rear yard. And the rear yard requirements are also a function of how tall your building is. The taller your building is, the larger your rear yard has to be. I kind of assumed a 3-story building and got to a 14-foot rear yard, but because of the parking requirements, I think in practicality, you'd have to have a larger yard. So when we say yard, we're not necessarily talking about like a lovely green space and that aforementioned bird bath that's prohibited in North Haven subdivision. We're basically talking parking because the parking has to go somewhere. And so it ends up going inside of your yard requirement. And in the BA zone in New Haven, you've got to have 1 parking space per dwelling unit, which is a lot of parking pretty quickly. Like a 20-space parking lot's a pretty big parking lot. And you have to not just have the parking lot, you've got to be able to drive to the parking lot. So you need, you've got to be able to get to it, and then you need laneways to like get into the spaces. So, I just did a little back of the envelope on this. Minimum parking space size in New Haven is 9 by 18. There are other towns where it's a little more. You can see, there are towns where it's 9 by 20 or whatever. New Haven is 9 by 18, and you very quickly find that you need a 4,000 square foot parking lot for this 20-unit building. And I just kind of did the math on the arithmetic on this particular lot. Like you basically end up needing a 40-foot rear yard because that's the only way to fit all the parking in there. New Haven, and that's 1 space per dwelling unit. New Haven calculates parking for retail by function of how many square feet of retail you have. So it's 1 space, the BA, it's 1 space for every 400 square feet of retail space. And then New Haven also requires bike parking, and New Haven allows you in a mixed use building like this to allocate a space that is allocated to one of the apartments can also be allocated to the retail on the theory that the people parking there are parking there at different times. But you basically can't reduce your parking requirement by more than 5% by function of shared parking. So there's a sort of cap on how that can work. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna just go through, I can figure out how to do this. I'm gonna stop the share. And I think I've already gone through the administrative stuff. So I'm not going to go through that again in terms of, okay, what happens if you want to build something that's not permitted as of right? Where do you go? What do you do? You know, variances and conditional uses I've already talked about. But the one thing I'll mention that I have not yet talked about is site plan review. So there are things that are permitted as of right in the code, right? Like you can do these, let's say we weren't planning to do residential on the first floor at this Ungers building, and it was all upstairs residential, first floor retail, and it fit within all the bulk parameters. So it was all as of right under the code. And we somehow squeezed in those 28 parking spaces, like we magically made all that happen. We'd still have to go to the city for approvals because of something called site plan review. Under site plan review, the city has jurisdiction, city plan commission typically, but sometimes on smaller projects, it's the city plan department, the staff. On site plan review, the city gets to say, well, show us where you're going to plant the trees, show us where you're going to do this, show us the ornamental things, show us that you're not going to end up like flooding this area by removing tons of soil, like show us your engineering, show us all this stuff. We can't stop you from building the thing, but we're going to have some feedback on how you plan to do it. That's called site plan review. And in New Haven, you trigger site plan review if you're building 3 or more units. In New Haven, you trigger site plan review if you're building 5,000 or more square feet. So almost everything of note triggers site plan review. Again, not the end of the world for a developer. Like, okay, we're going to get some feedback, cool. But it is a thing that you have to. It is a thing that you have to do. And for neighbors and others, it's an opportunity to have some feedback. Although you're not going to be able to kill a project plan review, you may be able to have some feedback on, you know, we think that there would be nice if there was some more trees in this corner, you know, shading, you know, this this development from this residential neighborhood next to it or something like that. I said, does site plan review require? Yeah, I mean, you do need site plan approval. You do need site plan approval. Like you have to be approved, but the basis for denying that approval can't be, we think too much for the neighborhood. Well, no, you know, the zoning permits 8 units, so you can't deny. So site plan ends up being more of a on the margins kind of conversation. I see that the questions have like built up in the chat while I was sharing my screen and couldn't see anything. So I'm happy to go through questions in the chat or take questions from the group, but however you think the, so there's just one comment that was private to me that site plan review is a public process. That's true. Site plan review is a public process, but there is a version of site plan review that is administrative at the administrative level. And then there's a version of site plan review that does not require a public hearing. So the so it happens publicly, but there may or may not be an opportunity for public comment. It depends on the nature of the project. Okay. Should I go through the questions in the chat? Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I would encourage people, because a lot of the questions were answered while you were talking. So if people have, I think, questions that haven't been answered, maybe just come on mic so we can, we don't have to wade through the chat if participants are okay with that. And Anika, I have a question that might be like a little bit outside the scope of this, but reading a code, could you brief on whether New Haven has or any chance of that?
Right. So a form-based code, and there's a couple of cities around the country that at this point have adopted a form-based code or a modified form-based code. I mean, Miami comes to mind. In Connecticut, the 2 places you hear, Hamden was the first place to adopt a modified form-based code in Connecticut, and then Hartford's got a form-based code today. So the idea of a form-based code is that it's less concerned about use, and it's more concerned about kind of like a coherent planning envelope. So it's almost form-based. When you look at a form-based code, it's like half pictures. Like, what do we want the streetscape to look like? And they tend to be designed on what's called a transect, which doesn't really fit every community, but the idea being that you kind of start from a downtown center that's more dense, and you go outwards to a place that's less dense, and that each of those phases in between would have a different what's called a form. I think that there are. So one thing that got mentioned in the chat is that one thing that's different about PDUs and PDDs is that they go to the board of alders for approval, and that is true because PDUs and PDDs are considered to be rezonings. And like I said at the beginning, in New Haven, the zoning commission is the board of alders. And so if you're going to rezone a parcel, it's got to go through the board of alders because they're our zoning commission. That's also a factor that makes it very hard to rezone things in New Haven because it's very politicized. You've got 30 alders that have got to sign on to a rezoning. And so that does make it hard. So it is not true for all cities in Connecticut, although rezoning can still be highly political in cities throughout Connecticut. New Haven's just a little unwieldy because you've got 30 alders, and we haven't had a kind of whole, like a revision of the code at large, like the whole thing, I don't think since the 60s. And again, that's not that weird either. New York also has not had a wholesale revision of its code since the 60s. How did Hartford do it? I'm not really sure. So Hartford's only got a 7-member Hartford City Council. So I'm just going to put that out there that might be easier to maneuver. And they had a city plan, chair who was motivated and had some political heft. So, there's some things going on there. Yeah.
Unrelated question, I guess, is like when a city does decide to rewrite their zoning code, what kind of thing would trigger that? Is it more political or constituents? Or...
Right. So, I mean, there's two different ways that this goes. So you can have a property owner zoning review, and typically that's about to build apartments that are going up on Chapel between Olive and the Firestone were done through a zone change. They could have been done through a series of variances or other things, but they did it through a zone change. The one thing that's different about changing the zoning as opposed to applying for a series of variances is the legal standard. And they probably knew they were going to get sued by the property owner across the street who's trying to maintain the value of their property. I mean, there's no other way to say it other than it's sort of basically a monopolistic move to try to prevent the other units from being built. And if they had done it as variances, they probably would have lost in court because the standard for granting a variance is high. But because it was a zone change, which is a legislative change, where the courts say, well, if the legislature wants to change the law, they get to change the law. Like, there's no standard for that. That's just whatever. Was it, was there some kind of bribery or like other thing involved? Because if not, like, that's the legislature gets to change the law. Doing it as a zone change, it's easier to win in court. Aaron is correct that there is a plan of conservation and development, and zone changes are supposed to comport with the plan of conservation and development. And that is true in pretty much every state in the country. That your zoning is supposed to comport with your planning, but in no state in the country do they actually enforce that requirement. Florida, Oregon, like there's a couple states where the courts give a crap whether your zoning complies with the planning, and in most states they don't, even though they're supposed to, like by the text of the statute they're supposed to. So one way to get to for a zoning amendment to be considered is that the property owner proposes it. Another way is that you have like people in City Hall, people in government who think it would be better if the zoning said something different. And that's what we saw with the commercial gateway stuff, is basically a, just like people in city, like the mayor and people in City Hall have priorities on all kinds of things. Like one thing they might have priorities on is how to change the zoning. And then so they might propose a rezoning, typically broader than a single parcel, neighborhood wide or whatever. When Grand Avenue rezoned from BA to BA1, that was led by the Grand Avenue Village Association, what is now the Special Services District for that neighborhood. When Westville Village rezoned from BA to BA2, that was led by Westville Village Renaissance Alliance, so a local consortium of businesses, property owners, residents, homeowners, et cetera, who said, I think, we think things might be better if we change this. So it can come from lots of different places. It doesn't, there's different ways that can end up on the table.
Well, it's past 7, so maybe could we take one more question if anyone in the audience has a question remaining?
Might be on mute. Sorry. I could, I guess, pose a question. Think in the back of my mind, it probably wouldn't be realistic, but what would be the process for anyone or any group or any entity to go and try to, say, remove the parking requirements from the city? Would that be some sort of across the board text change proposal or to the zoning regs or something like that? Some sort of variance or special exception? What would be that? What would be the process there?
So if it's an across the board, if you wanted to apply it citywide across the board, then the only approach is a zone change. Although I just take a step back and say that the next time, and Aaron probably knows this off the top of his head, I do not, when the city next is going through its comprehensive planning process, which is an every 10 years process, whenever that is, you don't have to wait for that. But whenever that is, you would definitely want to show up to that and testify at that, probably on a whole swath of issues, not just parking, but more generally, what from a planning perspective should the city be doing to make the city more pedestrian friendly, more bike friendly, et cetera. Like there's lots of planning considerations that implicate those things. And one of them would be parking, that, from a planning perspective, you think the city should have less prioritization for parking. So one thing is to intervene at the planning process. Now, getting the plan of conservation and development to address these issues, and I'm sure the one that we have already does to some degree, but even if it were stronger, that doesn't change the rules of the game. Like that's just here's our vision statement. In order to change the rules of the game, you have to actually amend the zoning code. Kevin says that the plan of conservation and development is only a couple of years old, so we're probably 6 or 7 years out from the next planning process. You're talking about a zoning revision, and it can be, towns have different rules on this. I currently have an application before the Woodbridge Planning and Zoning Commission. They call it the Plan and Zoning Commission for a zone change. We are doing that as a property owner. Like we have a site in town. We didn't want to have any, we didn't want there to be any debate that we could do it because we knew that what we were doing was and is controversial. But in a lot of towns, like the process for a zone change, and I haven't looked at New Haven recently, doesn't specifically require the applicant to be to be a property owner. And the reason for that is because, again, it's a legislative change. Like, it's a change to the, shouldn't have to be a property owner to propose a change to the law that's generally applicable. But again, I haven't looked at New Haven's zone change provision recently to see what their process says. But the most straightforward way in New Haven would just be to sit down with city plan department staff and say, you know, what is the appetite inside of City Hall for decreasing some of these parking requirements? Because there's appetite for that inside of City Hall. So that would be the most straightforward way, I think, politically in the city to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure we could keep discussing, but we really appreciate the hour and 10 minutes that you gave to us, Anika. Thank you so much. Everyone, round of applause. This was insanely informative, a lot to revisit as a group. So thank you again. And thank you everyone who made it out tonight to learn about zoning in our city. Before we end, I do just want to plug the Safe Streets group. And we have our group-wide meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m. I will put the Zoom link in the chat. So we meet as a group monthly. This meeting is going to be really exciting tomorrow because we are talking about some statewide legislation actually being introduced by Representative Roland Lemar with a provision to pilot automated traffic enforcement, which is something that our group is really excited about. So we're going to be talking about how to support that legislation tomorrow, among other things. So if you are interested in getting more in Safe Streets, we'd love to see you tomorrow at 6 p.m. And otherwise, have a great evening, everyone. And thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really great.
Thank you.